They say love is blind, but my heart felt a knife when I heard him say those words. I was Vivienne, the perfect fiancée, ready to marry Callum, the man I thought loved me back. Then she returned, his ex, the woman he never stopped loving. Days before our wedding, I heard him tell her that I meant nothing. I was just an obligation, not his true love. When I confronted him, Callum's cold eyes showed no remorse. His family shipped me away to a convent to hide their shame. They never expected me to return. They never expected me to be reborn with a chance to rewrite our story. This time, when he tries to send me away for his ex, I'll already be gone. And when he comes crawling back years later, he'll find me holding a child that isn't his. Diamonds sparkled on Vivienne's finger as she gazed at the engagement ring for what must have been the 100th time that day. The afternoon sun caught the precious stone, sending rainbows dancing across the parlor walls of the Montgomery estate. In just 3 weeks, she would become Mrs. Callum Montgomery, and the thought alone made her heart flutter with excitement. "It suits you," her mother had said when Callum had slid the ring onto her finger during his proposal. "The Montgomery jewels have waited generations for a woman like you." Vivienne smiled at the memory as she straightened her posture on the velvet chaise. The Montgomery family was among the most influential in high society, with roots that traced back centuries. Their vast fortune, built on shipping and banking, made them untouchable in social circles. And Callum, as the sole heir, carried the weight of that legacy on his broad shoulders. A servant entered the room with a silver tray. "A message from Mr. Montgomery, miss." Vivienne took the folded note, her smile fading slightly as she read its contents. Callum would be late again for their dinner plans. Business matters required his attention, the note explained in his elegant handwriting. He apologized and promised to make it up to her. It wasn't the first time, and deep down, Vivienne knew it wouldn't be the last. Since their engagement 6 months ago, Callum had grown increasingly distant. Their time together had become scarce, often interrupted by urgent business calls or family matters that pulled him away. "Is everything all right, miss?" the servant asked, still waiting by the door. "Yes, Thomas. Please inform the kitchen that I'll be dining alone tonight." Again, Vivienne folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. She walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling Montgomery Gardens where, in a few weeks, hundreds of guests would gather to witness their union. Everything was planned to perfection, from the imported flowers to the champagne from Callum's family vineyard in France. "It's just stress," Vivienne whispered to herself, a mantra she had repeated so often it had become her truth. Running an empire isn't easy. Later that evening, as Vivienne sat alone at the massive dining table, she picked at her food without appetite. The emptiness of the grand room echoed her growing concerns. Even when they were together, Callum seemed elsewhere, his mind occupied with thoughts he never shared. His kisses had grown perfunctory, his embraces brief, but tomorrow would be different. Callum had promised to escort her to Lady Pembroke's ball, a rare evening where they would finally be seen together in public since their engagement announcement. Perhaps surrounded by friends and well-wishers, she might glimpse again the warm, attentive man who had swept her off her feet a year ago. The next morning brought sunshine and renewed hope. Vivienne spent hours preparing, her lady's maid arranging her auburn hair in an elaborate style that framed her delicate features. Her gown, a creation of pale blue silk that matched her eyes, had been designed specifically for this occasion. When Callum arrived to collect her, Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. Tall and commanding in his formal attire, with dark hair swept back from his aristocratic features, he looked every bit the heir to the Montgomery fortune. His smile, though reserved, was genuine as he took her hand. "You look beautiful," he said, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to narrow. The ball was everything Vivienne had hoped for. The Pembroke mansion glowed with candlelight, the orchestra played sweeping melodies, and everywhere she turned, people offered congratulations on her upcoming marriage. With Callum's hand at the small of her back, she felt like the princess in the fairy tales she had loved as a child. "Everyone's talking about the wedding," whispered her friend Charlotte during a moment when Callum was drawn into conversation with business associates. "You're the envy of every eligible young lady in the country." Vivienne blushed with pleasure. "I know I'm fortunate. Callum is everything I've ever wanted. And what about what he wants?" Charlotte asked, her expression suddenly serious. "Are you truly what he desires or merely what his family expects?" The question stung, touching on insecurities Vivienne normally kept buried. "Of course I am. We love each other. Charlotte squeezed her hand apologetically. "I'm sure you do. Forgive me. It's just that rumors mention his frequent visits to the Montgomery offices rather late at night. He works hard," Vivian defended immediately. "The responsibilities of his position are enormous." The conversation was interrupted as Callum returned to claim Vivian for a dance. As they moved across the floor, she studied his face, searching for signs of the love he had once professed so fervently. His eyes met hers, but their green depths remained unreadable. "Is everything all right?" he asked, noticing her scrutiny. Vivian forced a smile. "Perfect. I was just thinking how handsome you look tonight." Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of what might have been guilt, before his practiced smile returned. "Not nearly as striking as you. Every man here envies me." The compliment should have warmed her, but instead it felt hollow, as if recited from a script rather than spoken from the heart. In the days that followed, Callum's absences grew longer. When Vivian visited the Montgomery house to discuss wedding details with his mother, the older woman's cool politeness did little to ease her growing anxiety. "Callum has always been dedicated to his responsibilities," Mrs. Montgomery said when Vivian delicately mentioned his absence. "It's one of his finest qualities. A wife must understand that duty sometimes takes precedence over personal desires." The unspoken message was clear. Vivian was expected to accept her place in the hierarchy of Callum's priorities, somewhere below business and family obligations. Still, she clung to her dreams. The wedding invitations had been sent, her gown fitted for the final time. Guests from across the country and beyond were arranging travel. It was too late for doubts, she told herself each night as she lay awake, wondering where Callum was and what thoughts occupied his mind when they were apart. "He loves me," Vivian whispered into her pillow, fighting back tears. "He chose me." But as the wedding drew nearer, the distance between them only seemed to grow, stretching like a chasm she could no longer pretend not to see. And in the quiet moments when truth broke through her careful defenses, Vivian began to wonder if what awaited her was the fairy tale she had imagined or something far more heartbreaking. The Montgomery estate hummed with activity as servants prepared for the wedding, now just 5 days away. Vivian had arrived early to review final arrangements with the staff, though she had barely seen Callum in the past week. His excuses were always the same: important business meetings, family obligations, paperwork that couldn't wait. She wandered through the mansion's east wing, admiring the fresh flowers that had been delivered that morning, when voices from Callum's study caught her attention. The door was slightly ajar and Callum's voice drifted through, uncharacteristically animated. "I never thought I would see you again," he was saying, his tone warm in a way it hadn't been with Vivian for months. Curiosity pulled her forward. She moved quietly, careful not to announce her presence. "Paris seems like a lifetime ago now," a woman's voice replied, soft and intimate. "But when I heard about your engagement, I knew I had to return." Vivian froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shouldn't eavesdrop. She knew that, but her feet refused to carry her away. "Eliza," Callum's voice caressed the name. "When you left, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever." Eliza. The name struck Vivian like a physical blow. She had heard it before, mentioned in hushed tones at social gatherings. Callum's first love. His childhood sweetheart who had abruptly left for Europe years ago, breaking his heart. "And now you're to be married," Eliza said, a question in her voice. There was a long pause before Callum answered. "It's complicated. The engagement to Vivian was arranged long ago. Our families have been planning this union since we were children." Vivian pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Arranged? He had proposed on bended knee in her father's garden, speaking of love and future happiness. Had that all been a performance? "And do you love her?" Eliza asked the question Vivian desperately needed answered. Another pause, longer this time. When Callum finally spoke, his words shattered Vivian's world. "How could I? I never stopped loving you, Eliza. Not for a single day. Vivian is lovely, and she'll make a suitable wife for someone in my position. But what I feel for her is obligation, not love." Tears burned Vivian's eyes as the truth she had been refusing to see was finally laid bare. Every distant look, every cancelled dinner, every perfunctory kiss suddenly made perfect sense. She was nothing more than a business transaction to him, a suitable match to satisfy family expectations. "What will you do?" Eliza's voice was closer now, as if she had moved toward him. "I don't know yet. The wedding is in 5 days. Breaking it off now would cause a scandal that would damage both our families. And if I told you I still love you too, that I made a terrible mistake in leaving?" Vivian didn't wait to hear his answer. She stumbled backward, needing to escape before she collapsed in the hallway. A vase on a nearby table wobbled as she bumped against it, sending it crashing to the floor. The conversation in the study abruptly stopped. "Vivian," Callum called out, his voice suddenly tense. She considered running, but instead straightened her spine and pushed the study door open. Let them see her. Let them know she had heard everything. Callum stood by the fireplace, his face pale with shock. Beside him was a stunningly beautiful woman with golden hair and porcelain skin. Eliza was everything Vivian was not, ethereal and delicate where Vivian was warmly human. "Vivian, this isn't what it looks like," Callum began, but the lie died on his lips as he registered her expression. "It's exactly what it looks like," Vivian said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice despite the tears streaking her cheeks. "It's the truth you've been hiding from me." Eliza at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should go," she murmured, moving toward the door. "Stay," Vivian said coldly. "This concerns you as well." She turned back to Callum. "You told me you loved me. Was that ever true, or was I always just an obligation?" Callum's handsome face hardened into something unfamiliar, his green eyes no longer even attempting warmth. "You heard enough to know the answer to that," he said. "I'm sorry you found out this way, but perhaps it's for the best." "For the best?" Vivian echoed, disbelieving. 5 days before our wedding? "You'll understand one day," Callum said dismissively. "This is what's best for both of us. The engagement was always about uniting our families, Vivian. You knew that, even if you chose to romanticize it." His callousness stunned her. This was not the man she thought she knew, the man she had agreed to marry. This cold, calculating stranger had been hiding behind a mask all along. "So what happens now?" she asked, fighting to maintain her dignity. Callum exchanged a look with Eliza before answering. "The wedding will be postponed indefinitely, of course. As for you, my mother has suggested a period of recovery might be beneficial." "Recovery?" Vivian repeated, confused. "The Sisters of Mercy maintain a convent in the north," he explained, his tone businesslike. "It's quiet, secluded. A perfect place for a young woman to heal from disappointment and avoid the gossip that will inevitably follow the cancellation of our engagement." The realization of what he was suggesting hit Vivian like ice water. "You're sending me away, to a convent. It's for your own good," Callum insisted. "The scandal would be unbearable otherwise. My family will cover all expenses, naturally. You'll want for nothing." Nothing except her dignity, her freedom, her place in society. Nothing except the future she had planned and the love she had believed in. "When do I leave?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Tomorrow morning, it's all arranged." Of course it was. They had planned this, probably from the moment Eliza had returned. The betrayal was complete. That night, Vivian packed her belongings in a daze, supervised by Callum's mother, who spoke of the arrangement as if it were a generous gift rather than an exile. "The sisters will take good care of you," Mrs. Montgomery assured her with cold efficiency. "And when a suitable period has passed, you may return to society, your reputation intact." By which time, Vivian understood, Callum and Eliza would be married, and the scandal would have died down. She would be forgotten, a footnote in their love story. The journey north was long and uncomfortable. Rain lashed against the carriage windows as they traveled farther from everything Vivian had ever known. The convent loomed against the gray sky like a prison, its stone walls promising isolation and solitude. Sister Ains, the Mother Superior, greeted Vivian with practiced compassion. "Many young women come to us in times of trouble," she said kindly. "You'll find peace here in time." But peace was the last thing Vivian wanted. Her heart burned with humiliation and grief as she was shown to her sparse cell, with its narrow bed and single window overlooking the windswept grounds. That evening, unable to bear the confines of her room, Vivian walked the convent grounds despite the raging storm. Rain soaked through her cloak, but she welcomed the physical discomfort as a distraction from her emotional pain. Lightning illuminated the sky as she followed a path along the cliff edge. The wind tore at her clothes and the rain blinded her. One misstep, one moment of inattention, and suddenly the ground gave way beneath her feet. She fell, tumbling down the steep slope, unable to catch herself. Pain exploded in her head as it struck a rock and darkness swallowed her consciousness. Her last thought before the world went black was of Callum's cold eyes as he had dismissed their love as nothing more than obligation. Vivian opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through familiar lace curtains. For a moment she lay disoriented, the memory of the rain and the fall still vivid in her mind. But this wasn't the convent. This was her bedroom in her father's house. She sat up abruptly, wincing at a phantom pain in her head that quickly faded. The calendar on her bedside table showed a date that made her breath catch in her throat. 10 years in the past, 1 week after Callum had proposed. Impossible, she whispered, reaching for a small hand mirror. Her reflection showed the same face, but somehow younger, unmarked by the betrayal and heartbreak she remembered so clearly. A knock at the door interrupted her racing thoughts. Her lady's maid, Rebecca, entered with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, miss. A letter arrived for you from Mr. Montgomery. He confirms he'll escort you to the opera tonight as planned." Vivian took the letter with trembling fingers. Callum's handwriting, the same elegant script that had dismissed her so coldly in what now seemed like a dream or a premonition. "Thank you, Rebecca," she managed to say. "What day is it?" Rebecca gave her a curious look. "Thursday, miss." "Are you feeling unwell?" "No, I'm fine. Just a strange dream that left me confused." After Rebecca left, Vivian paced her room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had it all been a nightmare? The betrayal, Elise's return, the convent? But it had felt so real, every painful detail etched into her memory. Real or not, one thing was certain: she wouldn't play the willing victim this time. If fate had somehow given her a second chance, she would not waste it. When Callum arrived that evening, handsome and attentive as he had been in the early days of their courtship, Vivian greeted him with a composed smile that masked her inner turmoil. His kiss on her cheek felt like a lie. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his green eyes warm with what she now recognized as practiced charm rather than genuine affection. "Thank you," she replied coolly. "Shall we go? I wouldn't want to be late." At the opera, Vivian observed Callum with new eyes. The way he preened before his peers, the calculated way he introduced her as his fiancée, the subtle distance he maintained even when holding her hand. How had she missed these signs before? During the intermission, Lord Blackwood, Callum's business associate, approached them. "Montgomery, a word about those shipping contracts." Callum excused himself, leaving Vivian alone. In her previous life, she would have waited patiently, perhaps chatted politely with the other ladies. Not this time. Instead, she circulated through the crowd, making a point to speak with influential members of society she had previously met only in passing. She discussed politics with a duchess, art with a wealthy patron, and literature with a renowned publisher. Each conversation was an investment in her future independence. When Callum returned, he seemed surprised to find her deep in conversation with the Minister of Finance. "I didn't realize you had an interest in economic policy," he said later in the carriage ride home, a note of curiosity in his voice. Vivian smiled enigmatically. "There's a great deal about me you don't know, Callum." The next morning, Vivian visited her father's solicitor, Mr. Harrington, a kind older gentleman who had always treated her with respect. "I'd like to make changes to my inheritance arrangements," she informed him once they were seated in his office. Mr. Harrington looked surprised. "Your father's will leaves everything to you already, Miss Vivian. Though upon your marriage, control would naturally pass to your husband." "That's precisely what I wish to change," Vivian said firmly. "I want my personal fortune placed in a trust that remains under my control regardless of my marital status." "This is most unusual," the solicitor frowned. "Mr. Montgomery might take offense." "Mr. Montgomery need not know the details of my financial arrangements," Vivian replied smoothly. "And if he does take offense, perhaps that tells us something important about his intentions in marrying me." After some persuasion, Mr. Harrington agreed to draw up the necessary papers. It was the first step in Vivian's plan to secure her future, no matter what happened with Callum. Over the following weeks, Vivian continued her campaign of quiet independence. She invested in her education, hiring tutors to teach her business and finance. She cultivated friendships with powerful women who had managed to carve out their own places in a male-dominated world. All the while, she maintained her engagement to Callum, playing the role of devoted fiancée in public while keeping her heart carefully guarded. When he questioned her new interests or activities, She deflected with charm, never allowing him to see the strategic mind that was working against his eventual betrayal. "My mother thinks you've changed," Callum mentioned one evening as they walked in her father's garden, the same garden where he had proposed. "How so?" Vivian asked innocently. "She says you seem more, I don't know, independent lately, less traditional in your thinking." Vivian plucked a rose from a nearby bush, inhaling its scent. "Is that a problem?" Callum hesitated. "No, not exactly. It's just unexpected. People are often more complex than they first appear," she said, thinking of how easily she had once been fooled by his surface charm. "Don't you find that fascinating?" He studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I suppose I do." As the months passed, Vivian became aware of Callum's growing restlessness. Sometimes she caught him watching her with a perplexed expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Other times he seemed distant, his mind elsewhere, just as he had been before. She knew what that meant. Eliza would be returning soon. Sure enough, 6 months into their engagement, rumors began circulating about a beautiful blonde woman newly returned from Paris. Vivian had heard the whispers at social gatherings, saw the way Callum tensed at any mention of returnees from abroad. Rather than confront him immediately, Vivian decided to wait. Let him reveal his true character in his own time. Meanwhile, she continued strengthening her position in society and securing her financial independence. The night Callum finally came to her father's house with a serious expression, Vivian knew what was coming. They sat in the drawing room, a proper distance apart as propriety demanded. "Vivian, there's something I need to discuss with you," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "Yes, Callum?" She kept her tone neutral, giving away nothing of the storm of emotions beneath her calm exterior. He cleared his throat. "Our engagement has been, well, it's been a wonderful time. You're an extraordinary woman." The familiar preamble to rejection. Vivian allowed him to fumble through his practiced speech, noting how he avoided mentioning Eliza directly. "I've come to believe that perhaps we rushed into this engagement," he finally said. "We might benefit from some time apart to consider whether this is truly what we both want." Vivian studied him, seeing clearly the cowardice behind his carefully chosen words. He wanted her to be the one to break the engagement, to spare him the scandal of jilting her. "I see," she said softly. "You've reconnected with Eliza." His shock at hearing the name was genuine. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter," Vivian interrupted. "What matters is that you're being honest finally." Relief washed over his features, quickly followed by wariness at her calm acceptance. "You're not upset?" Vivian smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. "No, I'm not upset. If your heart belongs to another, I would never stand in the way of true love." Well, thank you for understanding," he stammered, clearly thrown by her reaction. "My family suggested that perhaps a period of seclusion might be appropriate, to avoid gossip. There's a convent in the north." "That won't be necessary," Vivian said firmly. "I have my own plans." Callum frowned. "What plans?" "I hope you're happy together," Vivian said, ignoring his question as she stood to signify the end of their conversation. "Truly, I do." As he left, confusion evident in every line of his body, Vivian felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had navigated the same betrayal that had once destroyed her, but this time on her own terms. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities she had never dared imagine in her previous life. It was time for Vivian to write her own story, one that didn't depend on Callum Montgomery or his love, and she knew exactly where to begin. The whispers followed Vivian through the crowded ballroom. 2 weeks had passed since her engagement to Callum Montgomery had ended, and society was still buzzing with speculation. Rather than hide away in shame as everyone expected, Vivian had emerged transformed. Gone was the eager-to-please young woman who had lived for Callum's approval. In her place stood a mysterious, self-possessed beauty who moved through social gatherings with an air of quiet confidence that drew eyes wherever she went. "I heard he left her for his childhood sweetheart," a woman murmured behind her fan as Vivian passed. "Poor dear must be devastated," her companion replied. Vivian smiled to herself, adjusting the emerald necklace at her throat, a gift she had bought for herself from the funds she had secured before Callum could touch them. Let them think what they wished. She knew the truth that each day without Callum's false affection was a day of freedom. "Miss Vivian," a deep voice spoke from behind her. "You look radiant tonight." She turned to find Damien Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenscroft, watching her with undisguised interest. Tall and imposing, with raven hair and penetrating dark eyes, he had a reputation that made mothers pull their daughters close when he entered a room. Rumors of duels fought, fortunes won and lost at gambling tables, and countless broken hearts followed him like shadows. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a precise curtsy. "I trust you're enjoying the evening?" "More so now," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "Would you honor me with a dance?" In her previous life, Vivienne would have declined politely, mindful of her reputation. The old Vivienne had played by society's rules and still ended up humiliated and discarded. This Vivienne made her own rules. "I would be delighted," she said, placing her gloved hand in his. As he led her to the dance floor, she felt the weight of 100 stares. The disgraced almost Montgomery bride dancing with the notorious Duke of Ravenscroft. By morning, it would be the talk of every breakfast table in high society. "You've caused quite a stir these past weeks," Damien remarked as they moved through the steps of the waltz, his hand firm at her waist. "Most women in your position would retreat from society altogether." "Most women fear scandal more than they value their own happiness," Vivienne replied. "I've discovered I'm not one of them." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "No, you certainly are not. That's what makes you interesting, Miss Vivienne." As they danced, Vivienne caught sight of Callum across the room, his face tight with displeasure as he watched them. Beside him stood Eliza, luminous in pale pink, her golden curls arranged artfully around her perfect face. She was saying something to Callum, but his attention remained fixed on Vivienne. "Your former fiancé seems rather fixated on our dance," Damien observed, following her gaze. "Perhaps he's reconsidering his choices." "Too late for that," Vivienne said lightly. "Some decisions can't be unmade." When the dance ended, Damien didn't release her hand immediately. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my estate next weekend. I would be honored if you would attend." The invitation was bold, borderline scandalous. Unmarried young ladies didn't visit bachelor dukes' country estates unless they were willing to risk their reputations entirely. "I'll consider it," Vivienne answered, neither accepting nor declining. His eyes sparkled with amusement. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Vivienne." Most would either accept eagerly or reject with righteous indignation. "I'm not most people, Your Grace." "No, you most certainly are not." Later that evening, as Vivienne was preparing to leave, Callum intercepted her in the entrance hall. He had clearly been waiting for her, his posture stiff with determination. "I saw you dancing with Blackwood," he said without preamble. "You should stay away from him. His reputation is dangerous." Vivienne regarded him coolly. "I wasn't aware my choice of dance partners was still your concern, Mr. Montgomery." Callum flinched at the formal address. "Vivienne, please. I'm only thinking of your welfare." Blackwood is known for toying with women and discarding them. The irony of his warning wasn't lost on her. "How interesting that you should worry about me being discarded," she said, her voice like silk over steel. "Experience has made you quite the expert on the subject, hasn't it?" Color rose in his cheeks. "That's unfair. What happened between us was complicated. I never meant to hurt you." "Yet you did," Vivienne observed calmly. "But that's in the past now. Good evening, Mr. Montgomery. Give my regards to Miss Eliza." She walked away before he could respond, her head high, aware that he was watching her retreating figure with confusion. The old Vivienne would have melted at his concern, interpreted it as lingering affection. This Vivienne recognized it for what it was, the discomfort of a man whose discarded possession wasn't behaving as expected. The following week, Vivienne did attend Damien's gathering, arriving with her companion, Mrs. Winters, a respectable widow who provided the thin veneer of propriety required. The Duke's estate was magnificent, a Gothic mansion set amid rolling gardens that put even the Montgomery estate to shame. Over the weekend, Vivienne discovered that behind Damien's dangerous reputation was a man of unexpected depth. He was widely read, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, not with the polite pretense Callum had always shown. "You intrigue me," he told her as they walked through his extensive library. "Most people are so easily categorized, but you defy simple classification." "Should I take that as a compliment, Your Grace?" "Damien, please, and yes, it's the highest compliment I can offer." Predictability is the death of interest. As the weekend drew to a close, Damien invited her to return to his London residence for a small dinner party the following week. It was another step toward friendship, or perhaps something more, with a man society viewed as dangerously unsuitable. Vivian accepted without hesitation. Over the following months, Vivian became a fixture at Damien's gatherings. Their friendship blossomed into something society speculated about endlessly, but which defied easy labels. He introduced her to artists, writers, and freethinkers who expanded her world beyond the narrow confines of conventional society. Meanwhile, Callum and Eliza's courtship proceeded exactly as Vivian remembered from her previous life. Their engagement was announced with great fanfare, though Vivian noted the tight smiles and strained politeness whenever they encountered each other at social events. It was at Lady Hartsworth's midsummer ball that history repeated itself once more. Callum cornered Vivian on the terrace, his expression troubled. "I need to speak with you," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "About us." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "There is no us, Callum. Not anymore." "I think I made a mistake," he admitted, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Things with Eliza aren't what I expected. I keep thinking about you, about what we had." In her first life, Vivian might have yearned for these words. Now they merely confirmed her understanding of Callum's true character. A man who only wanted what he couldn't have. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, though she already knew. "I'm saying that perhaps we were hasty in ending our engagement. That perhaps, if you were willing, we might consider a reconciliation." Vivian studied him, seeing clearly the panic behind his eyes. Something had gone wrong with Eliza, just as it had in her previous life. He was looking for a safe harbor, a return to the woman who had once adored him unconditionally. "I think it's best if you honor your commitment to Eliza," Vivian said gently. "What we had is in the past, Callum. I've moved on, you should too." The shock on his face was almost comical. He had expected her to fall gratefully into his arms, to welcome him back without question. "It's Blackwood, isn't it?" he demanded. "He's turned you against me." Vivian shook her head. "No, Callum. You did that all on your own. Now if you'll excuse me, I believe Damien is waiting for me." She left him standing alone on the terrace, his carefully laid plans in shambles. As she rejoined the ball, Damien appeared at her side, offering his arm. Montgomery looked rather distressed, he observed. "Another attempt at reconciliation." Vivian smiled. "The last, I believe." Damien's eyes darkened with something that might have been possessiveness. "Good. I've grown rather fond of having you in my life, Vivian. I wouldn't want to share your attention." She looked up at him, seeing genuine affection in his gaze. "No fear of that, Your Grace. I've learned to recognize true worth when I see it." The music swelled as he led her onto the dance floor, and for the first time since her unexpected second chance, Vivian felt truly thankful for the twist of fate that had allowed her to rewrite her story. "Come with me to the capital," Damien said one evening as they sat in his library, the fire casting a warm glow over the leather-bound books surrounding them. It had been 3 months since Callum's failed attempt at reconciliation, and Vivian had spent much of that time in Damien's company. She looked up from the volume of poetry in her lap. "The capital? For how long?" "For as long as you wish," he replied, his dark eyes serious. "I have business there that will keep me occupied for several months at least. The season will be starting soon. It would be a chance for a fresh beginning, away from all the whispers and speculation here." Vivian considered the offer carefully. The capital was the heart of the kingdom, the center of power and influence. There, the shadow of the Montgomery name would not loom so large over her life. "What would people say?" she asked, though the question held little genuine concern. She had long since stopped allowing society's opinions to dictate her choices. Damien smiled, recognizing the question for what it was, a formality rather than a true objection. "They would say that the mysterious Miss Vivian has once again defied expectations by aligning herself with the notorious Duke of Ravenscroft. They would speculate endlessly about our relationship, and they would envy you your freedom, though few would admit it." "And what is our relationship, Damien?" Vivian asked boldly. "We've never truly defined it." He moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. "It is whatever we wish it to be. Friendship certainly. Alliance without question. As for anything more, I leave that entirely in your hands." The sincerity in his eyes touched her. Unlike Callum, who had hidden his true feelings behind empty words of love, Damien offered honesty without pretense. "Yes," she decided, "I'll come with you to the capital." 2 weeks later, Vivian arrived at the capital in Damien's elegant carriage. Mrs. Winters still serving as her companion to maintain at least a veneer of propriety. The city sprawled before them, a marvel of ancient architecture and modern ambition, with the royal palace rising above all else, its spires reaching toward the sky. Damien had arranged accommodations for her in a fashionable district not far from his own townhouse. The apartments were luxurious, with views of the central garden and staffed with discreet servants who asked no questions about the unusual arrangement. "Your first social engagement will be the Duchess of Lanford's reception tomorrow evening," Damien informed her as they toured her new residence. "She's an old friend and has agreed to introduce you to the right people. From there, your path is yours to determine." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "You seem very confident in my social abilities." "I've seen you navigate the treacherous waters of society after a broken engagement," he reminded her. "The capital may be larger, but the game remains the same. Only the players change." He was right. The Duchess of Lanford's reception proved to be the perfect introduction to capital society. The Duchess herself, a formidable woman in her 50s with a razor-sharp wit and an extensive network of influential connections, took an immediate liking to Vivian. "Damien tells me you managed to escape the clutches of the Montgomery hair," she remarked over champagne. "Good for you, my dear. I never did like that family, too convinced of their own importance. Now tell me what you hope to accomplish while you're here." Vivian hesitated only briefly before answering truthfully. "I want to build a life that belongs entirely to me, not defined by any man or family name." The Duchess's eyes sparkled with approval. "Then we shall get along splendidly. Independence is a rare commodity for women in our world, but not an impossible one." With the Duchess's patronage, doors opened for Vivian that might otherwise have remained closed. She was invited to exclusive salons where politics and philosophy were discussed openly, even by women. She attended literary readings where revolutionary ideas circulated freely among the intellectual elite. She visited art galleries showcasing works too provocative for provincial tastes. In this new environment, Vivian flourished. Her natural intelligence, tempered by the wisdom gained from her first life's mistakes, made her a sought-after companion in the most influential circles. She developed a reputation for insightful observations and subtle wit that made even jaded aristocrats pay attention when she spoke. Damien watched her transformation with undisguised admiration. Their relationship evolved naturally, without pressure or expectation. They attended many events together, but Vivian maintained her separate residence and her freedom to accept or decline invitations as she chose. "You've become quite the sensation," he remarked one evening as they left a diplomatic reception where Vivian had engaged the foreign ambassador in a lengthy discussion about international trade policies. "Half the men in that room were captivated, and most of the women were taking notes on your conversational tactics." Vivian laughed. "Hardly that. I simply spoke my mind." "Which is precisely what makes you so refreshing," Damien replied. "In a world of careful calculations and social maneuvering, your genuine interest and honest opinions stand out." 6 months into her residence in the capital, Vivian received a letter from home. The elegant script on the envelope was instantly recognizable as Charlotte's, her old friend from her former life. The letter contained news she had been half expecting. Callum and Eliza's engagement had been broken. According to Charlotte, Eliza had been caught in a compromising position with Lord Harrington, a wealthy baron with considerably more money than Callum. The scandal had rocked society, and Callum had retreated to the Montgomery country estate to lick his wounds. "History repeats itself," Vivian murmured, remembering her previous life where a similar scenario had played out. She showed the letter to Damien that evening over dinner at his townhouse, a private affair with just the two of them. "Are you surprised?" he asked after reading it. "Not in the least," Vivian admitted. "Eliza always preferred wealth over loyalty. In a strange way, I almost feel sorry for Callum." Damien studied her face. "But only almost. He made his choice," she said simply, "just as I made mine." Her choice had led her here to this moment, seated across from a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, who had never once asked her to be less than she was. The realization brought with it a certainty she hadn't felt since awakening in her second life. "Damien," she began, setting down her wine glass, "there's something I want to discuss with you." His expression grew serious. "You have my complete attention. These past months have been transformative for me. I've discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, dreams I never dared articulate, And much of that is due to your belief in me, your willingness to see me as an equal rather than a possession. You give me too much credit, he said softly. Your transformation was already underway when we met. I merely had the good fortune to witness it. Vivienne smiled. Nevertheless, you become essential to my happiness in a way I never anticipated. Not as a savior or a protector, but as a partner, a friend, and perhaps something more. Damien reached across the table to take her hand. Are you saying what I think you're saying, Vivienne? I'm saying that my independence remains precious to me, she clarified. But I no longer see partnership as its enemy. Not if it's the right partnership. The warmth in Damien's eyes deepened. I have never wanted to cage your spirit, only to walk beside you as you soar. If you'll have me as your partner in all things, I would be honored beyond words. Later that evening, as Damien escorted her back to her apartments, he paused beneath the starlit sky. I should do this properly, he said, suddenly dropping to one knee before her. Vivienne, you came into my life when I had resigned myself to solitude, believing no woman would accept both my title and my unconventional nature. You show me that true partnership enhances rather than diminishes individual strength. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife, not as your identity, but as one aspect of the remarkable woman you are? Tears welled in Vivienne's eyes, not of sadness or fear as they had once been when Callum proposed, but of joy and certainty. Yes, Damien, I will. Their marriage 3 months later was not the grand society affair that her wedding to Callum would have been. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony attended by the friends they had made in the capital, with the Duchess of Lanford beaming approval from the front row. As they exchanged vows, Vivienne silently thanked whatever twist of fate had given her this second chance. The path hadn't been easy, but it had led her to a happiness built on truth rather than illusion, strength rather than submission, and love rather than obligation. In the years that followed, Vivienne established herself as a respected figure in the capital's aristocratic circles. While Damien attended to his extensive business interests, she focused on philanthropic endeavors, establishing schools for girls and advocating for women's education. Together, they formed a partnership based on mutual respect that became the envy of society. And if, occasionally, news reached them of Callum Montgomery's continued misfortunes, neither mentioned it. The past was firmly where it belonged, a closed chapter in a story that had taken an unexpected but far more satisfying turn. 5 years passed in what seemed like the blink of an eye. Vivienne stood before the mirror in her dressing room, adjusting the emerald necklace Damien had given her for their last anniversary. The jewels complemented her deep green gown, designed specifically for tonight's annual spring ball, the most prestigious social event in the capital. "Mama, Mama," a small voice called from the doorway. Vivienne turned to see her 4-year-old son, James, running toward her, his dark hair a mess despite his nanny's best efforts to tame it. He had Damien's eyes and Vivienne's smile, a perfect blend of them both. She crouched down, careful not to wrinkle her gown, and opened her arms. "What is it, my little prince?" "Papa says I can stay up until you come home and tell me about all the dancing," James announced proudly, wrapping his small arms around her neck. "Does he now?" Vivienne laughed, glancing up to see Damien leaning against the doorframe, watching them with undisguised adoration. In his perfectly tailored formal attire, he looked every inch the powerful Duke, save for the softness in his eyes when he gazed at his family. "Only if you're good for Mrs. Winters," Damien clarified, crossing the room to join them. "And only if you're in bed, even if you're not asleep." James nodded solemnly. "I promise." Vivienne kissed his forehead before standing. "Then I shall remember every dance and every silly hat to tell you about tomorrow." After James was escorted back to the nursery by his nanny, Damien pulled Vivienne close. "Have I told you how breathtaking you look tonight?" "Only twice," she teased, smoothing his lapel. "Losing your touch, your grace?" He laughed, the sound warm and rich. "Never. I simply wanted to ensure you don't forget it before we enter a ballroom full of admirers." The grand ballroom of the royal palace was alive with music and laughter when they arrived. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the assembled elite of society. As Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, Vivienne and Damien were announced with ceremony, their entrance causing a momentary lull in conversation as heads turned to observe them. The Duchess of Lanford, now one of Vivienne's closest friends despite their age difference, approached immediately. "There you are, my dears. I was beginning to think you decided to skip the tedium altogether." And missed your commentary on everyone's fashion choices. Never, Vivian replied warmly, embracing the older woman. Well, you'll have plenty to observe tonight, the Duchess said with a meaningful glance toward the far side of the ballroom. The prodigal son has returned. Vivian followed her gaze and felt a jolt of recognition. Callum Montgomery stood near the refreshment table, looking older and somewhat diminished from the proud, confident man she remembered. His once immaculate appearance now showed signs of neglect, his clothing fine but not quite fashionable, his posture less commanding. I heard his family finally forced him to come to the capital to salvage what's left of their business interests, the Duchess continued in a low voice. Apparently, he's made quite a mess of things since the Eliza debacle. Damien's hand tightened slightly on Vivian's waist. Shall we move to the other side of the room? Vivian shook her head. No need. That part of my life is long past. As the evening progressed, Vivian danced with Damien and several other distinguished gentlemen, enjoying the music and conversation. She was deep in discussion with the foreign minister about her latest charitable project when she felt a presence at her elbow. Lady Ravenscroft, Callum's voice was exactly as she remembered, though perhaps a bit rougher around the edges. Might I have a moment of your time? The foreign minister excused himself discreetly, leaving Vivian face to face with her former fiancé. She regarded him calmly, noting the new lines around his eyes, the slight slump to his shoulders that spoke of defeat. Mr. Montgomery, she acknowledged with a polite nod. It's been some time. 5 years, 3 months, he said, surprising her with his precision. You look well, very well. Thank you, she replied. What brings you to the capital? I understood you preferred country life these days. A flash of something, perhaps shame, crossed his face. Business matters, the family interests require attention here. Vivian nodded, unsurprised. According to her sources, the Montgomery shipping empire had faltered under Callum's management after his father's death, beset by poor decisions and neglect. I heard about your marriage, Callum continued, his eyes flicking to where Damien stood across the room, deep in conversation with several distinguished gentlemen. The Duke of Ravenscroft, an unexpected choice. For whom? Vivian asked with a slight smile. I found him to be exactly what I needed. Callum shifted uncomfortably. I always thought you would, that is, I had hoped one day we might find a way back to each other. The admission hung in the air between them, as pathetic as it was honest. Vivian felt no satisfaction at his regret, only a distant pity for the man who had once held her heart in his careless hands. Callum, she said gently, that possibility ended the moment you chose Eliza over me. Some decisions can't be undone. I know that now, he admitted, his voice low. I made a terrible mistake. Eliza was, well, you probably heard what happened. Vivian had indeed heard. After leaving Callum, Eliza had married Lord Harrington, only to leave him as well when an even wealthier prospect appeared. Her reputation was in tatters after several very public scandals. I'm sorry things didn't work out as you hoped, Vivian said, meaning it. Holding on to bitterness served no purpose in the life she had built. Callum looked at her intently. Are you happy, Vivian? Truly happy? Before she could answer, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A small boy in pajamas had somehow evaded his caretakers and burst into the ballroom, his dark hair flying as he ran directly toward Vivian. Mama! James called out, oblivious to the formal setting where the hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed on him. Mama, I couldn't wait. I wanted to see the dancing. Vivian crouched down as James barreled into her arms, aware of Callum's shocked gaze. My darling, you're supposed to be in bed, she scolded gently, though she couldn't suppress her smile at his excitement. But Mrs. Winters fell asleep and I wanted to see you and Papa, James explained, his eyes wide with the adventure of his escape. Damien appeared beside them, having crossed the room the moment he spotted their son. I believe this young gentleman has broken his promise, he said with mock severity belied by the twinkle in his eyes. I'm sorry, Papa, James said, not looking particularly repentant. Is this a real prince's ball like in my stories? Damien laughed, lifting the boy into his arms. Not quite, but close enough. And now you've seen it, so it's time to return to your castle. Only then did Damien acknowledge Callum's presence with a brief nod. Montgomery, I trust you're well. Duke, Callum replied stiffly, his eyes fixed on James. You have a child. Is he your friend, Mama? James asked, studying Callum with childish directness. Vivian straightened, meeting Callum's gaze steadily. This is Mr. Montgomery, an acquaintance from long ago. And yes, Callum, this is our son James. You have a child, Callum repeated, his voice hollow. A family. Yes, Vivian confirmed simply. Something crumbled in Callum's expression, some last vestige of hope perhaps. He looks like you. Around the eyes. Everyone says he has his father's eyes, actually, Vivian corrected gently, exchanging a warm glance with Damien. Mrs. Winters arrived then, flustered and apologetic for losing track of her charge. After ensuring her that no harm was done, Damien handed James over to her care, but not before the boy demanded and received goodnight kisses from both his parents. As James was led away, Callum watched with an expression of such naked longing that Vivian felt a twinge of sympathy. He's a beautiful child, he said quietly. You must be very proud. We are, Damien replied, placing a protective hand at the small of Vivian's back. If you'll excuse us, Montgomery, I believe they're playing our song. As Damien led her toward the dance floor, Callum called after her. Vivian, I just want to know, are you happy with him? Vivian paused, turning back to face the man who had once broken her heart. Yes, Callum, she said with perfect honesty. I am happier than I ever imagined possible. His face fell further, if that were possible. But you were meant to marry me. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. And you were meant to love me, but you didn't. Without waiting for his response, she rejoined Damien, slipping into his arms as they moved gracefully across the dance floor. What did he say to you? Damien asked, concern in his eyes. Vivian smiled, feeling nothing but gratitude for the path that had led her to this moment. Nothing important, nothing that matters anymore. Over Damien's shoulder, she caught a final glimpse of Callum, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, watching as she danced with her husband. She felt no triumph at his obvious regret, only a peaceful certainty that everything had worked out exactly as it should. As the music swelled around them, Vivian leaned closer to Damien, breathing in the familiar scent of him. Take me home, she whispered. I promised our son a bedtime story. Damien's eyes softened with love as he nodded. As my Duchess commands. They left the ball without looking back, returning to the home they had built together, to the life that was everything Vivian had once thought lost to her forever. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she silently thanked that stormy night at the convent for the fall that had given her the chance to rise again, stronger and wiser than before.